And we're on to our final reader for the night, Patricia Kirkpatrick. Patricia received the first Lindquist and Vennum Poetry Prize for her book Odessa, published by Milkweed Editions, and was awarded the 2013 Minnesota Book Award in Poetry. She has taught writing in many academic and community settings. Please welcome Patricia.
Hello. I love these readings because there's such a range of people here, and that's a really delightful thing. It's a good book, and also has a range of writers. So I wanted to read something that I didn't write, just to show you. This is a piece of humorous writing by John Witt, who happens to be my neighbor, but you may know him from his, John Moe, excuse me, from the Witt's program. He, which is a national program of humor and music and general revelry. It's a lot of fun to go to. And he and his family moved here about 4 years ago from Seattle, where I spent a lot of time. So I asked him to write a piece for the Almanac. I have been a community editor with Lisa and others. But this last year, Pamela Fletcher and I actually did some of the editing that Kimberly has done all these years, which meant that we really both solicited work and that's a good word for being an editor. It's sort of being a bridge between the writer and the reader, so that what comes out of your heart and your hard work will work on the page for somebody who doesn't know you and doesn't have the benefit of listening to you read it. So this was one of the pieces solicited. It's a piece of prose. I'm going to read the last 3 sections. It's called 5 Things to Love About St. Paul from Someone Who Moved Here from Somewhere Else. And this is John Moe. So section 3, 4, and 5. Things hold still. In Seattle, my house was on a fault line. For real. The fault line ran literally underneath my house. For my wife, this meant constant panic that the big one was about to arrive. For me, a native Northwesterner, it meant the following rationale. I haven't been killed by an earthquake yet, therefore I never will be. Our lives of terror, hers, and stupidity, mine, were inadvisable and honestly no way to live. But in St. Paul, oh, St. Paul, everything stays put. And not just seismically. The people stay put too. The tectonic plates of human events don't leave people adrift like human Pangea chunks. Oh, I'm not from here, said one of my new neighbors. That was not me. Said one of my new neighbors when I first moved here. I grew up in Mendota Heights. What did she do? Walk? I have noticed that plenty of St. Paul kids do move away for college and a while after, but return when it's time to get married, have kids, and settle down. If you'll pardon my Washington State metaphor, they're like salmon, venturing out into the world, returning home to spawn and die. And this is section 4, the otherness of not being Minneapolis. I'm not interested in the argument about which twin city is better. I love them both. But St. Paul is smaller and gets less attention and is therefore odder and more interesting. St. Paul is Garfunkel. St. Paul is Oates. St. Paul is DJ Jazzy Jeff to Minneapolis's Fresh Prince. When I knew my family was moving to the Twin Cities, I instantly wanted to live in St. Paul, even though I knew very little about either city. It just seemed inherently more comedic to live in a smaller place, especially because it's the capital of the land of 10 billion lakes, and the whole city has just 6 lakes, only 2 of which I've ever heard of, and I've lived here 5 years. Come on, that's hilarious. And this is 5, the incomprehensibility of city planning. In Seattle, I lived on 45th Avenue. I grew up on 299th Place. In my section of St. Paul, nothing has a number. St. Paul is a vast grid of named streets with no discernible logic or order to it. So all you need to do is memorize the order of every street everywhere, and you're fine. This frustrates Minneapolitans and out-of-town visitors to no end, thereby lowering the chances that they'll move here and clog up the streets with more traffic. It's the perfect system. That's John Mull. And you know, his work it's been in the New York Times, he's published a number of books, he's been a punk rocker in the Seattle grunge scene. And so when I asked him to write that, I said, now I know, John, that what we're going to pay you won't even take your family out for hamburgers. But that in itself is hilarious. And so he agreed and wrote that. This is St. Paul Min by Connie Wannick. Some of you may know her as a wonderful poet. She lives in Duluth. She's published a number of books, and she has another one coming out soon. This is St. Paul Min, and it's the very last poem in the, if you're following 290, but it's the last page of actual writing in the book before the calendar thing, or not the calendar, but the
City Guide?
City Guide, thank you. St. Paul Min. Always there was more than one St. Paul. Many fell off horses, many were saved, many lost to the flood as water climbed the garden wall, as waves surged over the threshold. A Paul and Pauline came aboard the ark and took their muddy sandals off of the door like good Minnesotans. Lord, I believe. Forgive me my disbelief. My cousin Paul, born in Minneapolis, was no saint. His twin, Peter, inherited the family conscience. Strangers couldn't tell them apart until one of them apologized. The old streets tumbled downhill toward the poor brown Mississippi, a hard-working river, a heavy drinker. It's moving south, as many do, only to return as summer rain. Watch the water from afar, don't fall under its spell. Then turn around. There's the Capitol, the crown, the golden noggin, and within, the same bickering that began in Eden. This next poem I'm going to read was in the St. Paul Almanac, I think, 2 years ago, maybe. Nothing in this year, because it's very uncouth for an editor to put her own work in a magazine. But the poem did go into my book, Odessa, which was published this year. And I'm really pleased that it was in the St. Paul Almanac first. It's called Letter from United. Almost 6 years ago, I had a brain tumor removed the size of a baseball from my head, and I was in United Hospital for the surgery and then the recovery in the Sister Kenny rehab unit. And when they wheeled me into Sister Kenny, which is way on the top floor of the hospital, it was a room with 2 beds side by side, and the first bed, as I'm being pushed in on my gurney, looked right at the wall where all the machinery and the tubes and hung, and so you'd be looking. That's what your view would be from the bed. And I just said very casually, of course I was on a lot of drugs, if you put me in that bed, I'll try to kill myself. And my daughter turned to me later and said, well, she was a psychology major at the time, she was at college, and she said, Mom, they put you on a suicide watch. But here's why I tell that. The second bed had a window overlooking the St. Paul Cathedral, and I really feel like it saved me, it helped me heal to see that all the time. So this is Letter from United. Of course I heard voices in the night, saw visions, felt the presence of dying, that white fringed place. Shallow breath, narrow entrance, the door to death opened. Then came steroids and lack of inhibition. There was terror, I admit it. Just before I learned the news, I realized all you have meant to me. and I thought I had too much feeling to continue to spend time with you. I had a brain tumor, and it had to come out. Damage, seizure and aura, the gray dome of the growth, or a cathedral lit at the top where the cross is. Flora wrote, so much of life we find in the funniest places. Boundaries, love, bone, cutting, and stitches, more blood than the surgeon had ever ordered. I knew I needed your help for the children, the family I might have to leave. I'm writing to say I can make the changes. I am writing to say I have been opened and closed. I am writing to say that today when the nurse came to change my dressing, she glanced up and said, "Oh, look, is that snow?" We looked out the window and saw it together. First flakes, those white fringed birds flying, the first snow of the new season. And this is actually a prose poem, which would take too long to explain what the form of a prose poem is. It's a poem written in sentences as if it were a story, but it's still a poem. It's quite a bit more complicated than that. But I want to say something about this poem. I've never read it before, and I appreciate the chance to read it tonight. And it's related to my work with the St. Paul Almanac, which has been maybe 4 or 5 years now. Is that about right, Kimberly? I'm very proud that in my 30-some years of teaching in many colleges and universities, as a writer in the school at J.J. Hill Montessori School, Highland Park Elementary School, Central High School, I was always very diligent about making sure that we read James Baldwin, Joy Harjo, Langston Hughes, Gary Soto, Toni Morrison, really a range of writers who were of different backgrounds and colors than mine. And I'm glad that I did that. But what has happened to me since I've worked with the Almanac and worked with a lot of different people for myself and really thought about race in a much deeper way is that it's really entered my consciousness in a way that it never did just by literature, I think. And it's really helped me see what's at stake, that we have these conversations with each other. And I don't really know what else to say. I hope that you can hear what I'm saying. So in this poem, I've been working on it for about 8 years, and it was not working at all. I started to write it shortly after my mother died, and you may recognize the reference to a mother in this, although she appears as an apparition. And another reference that I'll just tell you about is something that happened very recently in my neighborhood, and I found it to be really troubling for the obvious reasons. You'll probably recognize what I'm talking about when it comes. But other than that, I'm really grateful, Jay Otis, for what you read about the Mississippi and how it flows and how the imagination can take us to memory and memory can take us to the imagination. Because a lot of this poem is completely made up. But it enabled me to get some things into it that I didn't know how to write about in any other way. So it's called The Flower That Does Not Come Back. One night, nobody put the children to bed. Toddlers drooped in swings. Babies kicked yeasty feet inside buggies. Dusk settled in the cut grass lawns like ashes. A nightbird called. And I lost the power to tell the figures in my dreams from those we call real. The husband of the neighbor, expecting a baby, finished mowing their lawn before dark. Nobody noticed his skin color. Nobody called the police. The police didn't come. The police didn't knock on his front door and ask him to prove he lived in that house. Mock orange persisted. Cicadas whined like screws wound tighter and tighter in wood. Nobody counted. Nobody hurried. Dreams went to sleep in beds, the children left empty. One child wandered, Guides took her to porch steps where milk bottles sat. They walked her past cars where hunters heaped deer on the hoods. They led her through gardens, mostly annuals, rotting or flowering, zinnia, cosmos, marigold, the flower that does not come back. The dreamer saw everything, but nothing belonged to her. If there was a gate, she opened it. If there was a horse, she rode. If she saw a lake, she put a boat in the water. If she heard a bird, she listened. When she came to a field, she gleaned enough grain to keep going. At the crossroad, she made up her mind. "Mother," she called, when she saw a figure walking ahead of her, a woman, 19, unmarried and pregnant. But the dreamer couldn't be two places in time. When you look through a dream, small things get bigger. The world widens up, but it has to be real. Then you keep finding more and more things in it. You become the limiting element. That night, the moon slipped between clouds. Sumac and wild aster wavered. Then plates of the infant's skull overlapped to fit through the canal. Everything changed. Nothing was out of the ordinary. The dreams woke up. The children got sleepy. And the dreamer went home to be swaddled. Thank you so much. Just a tremendous range of writing here, and you've heard it tonight. Real histories of lives that we don't see anymore. The ice cream factory, beautiful story. Lisa's poems that are not only of the natural world, but of the train tracks running through the natural world, and so buy it. How's that for an advertisement?
Thank you.